communities of interest, and transparency. Our second panelist is Alex Katsura, who is a legal director of the Prison Policy Initiative in Delaware. Alex has worked with the Prison Policy Initiative in various capacities since 2003 and has been the legal director there since 2009. She is a graduate of the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York City, and she played a central role in building the Prison Policy Initiative's campaign against prison gerrymandering, including her publication, Prison Gerrymandering in Massachusetts, How the Census Bureau Prison Miscount Invites Phantom Constituents to Town Meetings. Alex holds a BA from Smith College in Government and History. And she's also been especially helpful to our work at LWVDE in prison gerrymandering. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Yuri, Yuri, you can share your slides with everyone, and everyone else, as Kira has instructed, would be helpful just for bandwidth if you were to close your picture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Denise. Are the slides showing up? Am I showing up? This is a new feature that I'm testing out on all of you for the first time, where I'm going to All right, so I'm going to be superimposed here over the slides. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. As Denise said, I'm Yuri Rudensky. I'm a redistricting counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice in New York. The Brennan Center is an independent, nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to reform, revitalize, and defend our country's systems of democracy and justice. Redistricting has long been a core part of that mission. As an attorney at the Brennan Center, I wear several different hats. I do policy work in the states and on the federal level. I litigate redistricting matters, and we also engage with the public in a number of different ways. We create resources, and of course we do events such as this one. And it's really great to see the turnout today, especially as we are on the threshold of the 2021 redistricting cycle. I'm going to be covering a couple of things today. Two topics principally. I'm going to talk about communities of interest and focusing on a definition. What is a community of interest? Why we should care about communities of interest and why redistricting should respect them. And finally, how do you identify communities of interest? What do you do to articulate exactly what a community of interest is? Then I'll transition to talk about transparency and essentially what are the best practices and what some tips for groups such as the League and other civic and civil rights grassroots organizations that are going to be engaged in the redistricting cycle. Just some, again, tips and best practices for preparing testimony and so forth. Before we jump into all of this, though, I wanted to briefly lay out a couple of values that I apply to redistricting and my work, so we have a common understanding. To me, the goal of redistricting should be to draw districts that are equitable and responsive to political needs. That means a couple of things. To be equitable, districts must reckon with the past, the long and uninterrupted legacy of racism that's deeply embedded in our representational systems from the Electoral College on down. This is something that redistricting and map drawers have to be aware of. To be responsive, districts must also be mindful of the present. They should be able to capture the changes that have occurred over the last 10 years and account for the trends going forward. Maps are drawn for a decade at a time. And so it's important to have maps that aren't just reflective of what today holds, but what tomorrow will bring as well. And this applies equally to demographic trends to the extent that this country and your particular state, different communities are growing at different rates, but also to account for political trends and the political inclinations of the population. To advance these two values that are really kind of my main guiding principles, respecting the representational needs of communities of interest and conducting the redistricting process in a transparent and accessible way are kind of indispensable. And so on that note, why don't we dive right into the substance here? So communities of interest, this has existed as a concept since about approximately the 70s, when a couple of courts, one in California, I think in 1973, and then a bit later in the 80s in Colorado, articulated this as one of these orienting principles that redistricting can take. And the way that I tend to define a community of interest, it's a group of people that shares a common geography. So you have to be able to draw a single contiguous district, meaning no islands in different parts of the state. And it's a group of people that share a common representational needs based on cultural, racial, ethnic, economic, social, or historic ties. What communities of interest are not are a group of people that share a political party preference or loyalty to a particular candidate. The entire goal of orienting redistricting around identifying and preserving communities of interest is to get away from a process oriented toward producing certain political outcomes and one toward serving the representational needs of a state's various communities. And the communities of interest are best thought of as one of the criteria for redistricting. And one of the things that we at the Brennan Center have pulled together is model legislation and a guide to the model legislation for how redistricting reform, how a state should write its laws that pertain to redistricting. And we recommend that the redistricting criteria, first and foremost, you have to ensure that districts have equal populations. So that's the top value that map drawers should seek to advance. Second, districts should be contiguous, meaning that there should be one continuous boundary. You shouldn't have a non-connecting communities that are considered part of the same district. Third, it's ensuring that communities of color have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of choice. And then fourth, it's preserving communities of interest. So you get through these federal requirements, these constitutional requirements, and then communities of interest should be the next value that is advanced. Currently, 15 states have communities of interest written into their criteria. The Federal For the People Act, which is S1 and HR1, contains that as a guiding principle for drawing congressional districts, and that's something that we're working on and really hoping passes and passes soon. And all of the definitions, whether they're in state law, whether they're in the For the People Act, center around this concept of finding some sort of glue, some organizing principle that holds communities together, that creates a political community out of those folks, where there is a common representational need or needs that should be reflected, that should be represented at the state capitol and in Congress. Delaware does not have a formal requirement that communities of interest be preserved, but that doesn't mean that communities of interest can't be something that the map drawers, the legislators who will be districting the legislature in the next couple of months, that they can't still orient around that they still can't consider the public input and use that as something that they really take to heart when making redistricting choices. The reason why it's so important to orient redistricting around communities of interest is that the goal of redistricting should be to capture the ways that a state's population has changed over the decade. That's where the requirement that redistricting take place every 10 years comes from. It's that there is an obligation imposed by the federal constitution that all representative districts at the federal level, at the state level, and even at the local level have roughly the same number of people and are adjusted periodically to reflect the fact that populations grow at different rates. And in some cases, populations can shrink in different parts of a state. And so there has to be a periodic rebalancing. But that numerical component doesn't answer the question of, that answers the question of how big should districts be? How many people should each district contain? It doesn't answer the question of how do you decide which people those are? How do you group different populations, different households, different communities together in a way that makes sense, in a way that gives people effective representation? And so I like to say that there's another component to redistricting and another reason why we want to do this periodically, because over the course of a decade, communities change. Communities change in the way that people live, in the way that people work, play, and these are just as important to capture as the changes in the raw numbers of a population. And so what a community of interest as part of the criteria do is it orients redistricting to capture those demographic and lifestyle changes that occur within a state over the course of a decade. And so the best way to capture communities of interest is through public input and public testimony. No one knows their community better than the people themselves. They know where they work, they know where they use parks, where their kids go to school, all of these different things that form a geographic community and that form an area that should be kept whole for purposes of representation. You can use data, and the American Community Survey, known as the ACS, does provide a wealth of information about the population that includes things like income, that includes things like demographic characteristics, household characteristics, educational attainment, all sorts of different information. And that can be a useful way to start to come up with a rough sketch of where various communities of interest may be. There might be municipal data sources and in particular, various maps that exist. Things like utility districts, school districts, watersheds, et cetera. And these are all very, very useful, especially when you overlay them to identify areas that should be preserved in redistricting. But one of the things that I really do want to emphasize is that interacting with the public, listening to public testimony, and going to the people for this information is really indispensable. And there's an excellent example. So the California redistricting process in 2011 really oriented itself around identifying and preserving communities of interest. And one of the really surprising things that the commission found when it started holding hearings and thinking about redistricting choices that it would have to make was in the LA area. They held a hearing, and the geography of LA is such that the Santa Monica Mountains kind of run east to west, and they split what is known as the LA Basin to the south from the San Fernando Valley to the north. And in most prior maps, people kept these hilltop communities in the Santa Monica Mountains together because they are similar in terms of various representational needs when you look at the data. But when the commission went and held hearings, what they heard was people on the Los Angeles side of the mountains have a wildfire concern that people on just the other side of the mountains don't share, and that this was a very significant representational need, and that this is a community that wanted to be able to elect a representative that would raise these concerns and give this community the representation that it needs to be able to address the fact that wildfires tend to occur on one side of these mountains rather than the other, even though otherwise these areas share much in common. But the important thing with communities of interest and the important thing with processes that are oriented around public input is recognizing that different communities, some communities have barriers to access, that it's not as easy to engage in public process, that it's not as easy to show up at a hearing and devote hours of a day to waiting for an opportunity to weigh in, that there may be language barriers, there may be technological barriers in today's environment. And so when thinking about communities of interest, it's important to apply that sort of equity lens and think about whether there are some communities of interest that haven't been heard from, but that do exist. And so it's not just, it's important not to just tally how many comments are made, but it's also important to consider where is that input coming from. And the thing about communities of interest and with redistricting in general, there's two ways that you can think about it. You can think about the process of redistricting and the outcomes in redistricting. And in certain respects, these are two separate things. With communities of interest, that's an outcome that a redistricting process is striving to preserve and orient districts around preserving. Transparency is all about process, and it's an indispensable part of ensuring that redistricting is oriented toward communities rather than serving political interests. And
Can I stop you for a minute? We have a few questions in the chat box
Sure.
around communities of interest, and we might just want to take a few minutes to address them before you run into transparency. Do you mind?
I don't mind at all.
Okay.
By all means.
So one question is around whether or not it's a positive thing to have diverse, inclusive communities. In other words, have them all together. And the question is where there's really not a single community of interest in a given geographical area. What are the pros and cons of that?
Well, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
I think what the question is having a community of interest where you have a collective group together versus having a diversity of communities of interest around. So in other words, spreading them out versus all together.
It's a good question. I think the most important thing to remember with communities of interest is it's really that there needs to be some organizing principle. There needs to be some justification for why redistricting choices were made and lines were drawn in a particular way that lumps a particular group of people and a set of communities together. There has to be a reason for it. It can't just be an accidental thing. And usually it's not an accidental thing, most often because redistricting tends to be a highly partisan process. There's a partisan motive behind redistricting choices. What communities of interests are all about is not trying to diminish diversity within a political district. It's about saying, hey, this is a group of people that commutes into Philadelphia for work. In this part of Delaware, it is a commuting corridor. Folks are heading that way. They have a different set of needs than a different community that might be geographically proximate, but is oriented toward a different job center or the nature of the work that people do there is different. The industries that serve that area are different, so on and so forth. So the thing about communities of interest is there are a number of different ways that they can be defined. But the key is there has to be some reason for grouping a set of people together for political representation. And the reason why that's important is really it's all the various downstream implications. You want candidates to be able to articulate platforms that's going to resonate with a large number of people in a particular district. You want people to be able to organize and be able to put pressure on representatives to raise certain issues at the state capitol. And I mean, in Delaware is a single congressional district state, but in states that draw congressional districts at the national level. And so that's really the key. And one of the things that you see when communities of interest are preserved is some of these other values that people tend to find important, like whether legislative races are competitive. That happens naturally, and it's a natural sort of competition. It's not manufactured. It's not reducing people to partisan labels and thinking about, oh, in this community, they're Democrats, and in that community, they're Republicans. And if we draw Democrats and Republicans together, we're going to create a competitive district, and that is good. That's still manufacturing a political outcome. But if instead you are thinking, hey, here's a group of people that share a specific set of needs, that are concerned about a particular watershed where they draw their water, or that are concerned about traffic and a commuting corridor in order to be able to get to work. Then you have both parties sort of competing with solutions. You have competition at the primary level, and it's a better form of politics that results from that, which is one of the reasons why we feel so strongly about orienting redistricting around identifying communities of interest rather than producing political outcomes.
Thank you, Yuri. The second question was around how to include the calculus of political affiliation, but I think you've answered that in your explanation. So I will stop interrupting and let you go on to transparency.
The one thing I would add about political affiliation is that is something that should be considered on the back end. Once districts are drawn, once communities of interest have been identified, you do want to consider, well, what is the likely outcome of this plan that has been drawn, and is it completely out of step with the politics of the state? And that's where it is appropriate to consider, is this inadvertently a partisan gerrymander? But if you lead with partisanship, even if your goal is to draw the right number, the right number of Republican seats and Democratic seats and toss-up seats, you're still approaching the task thinking about producing a legislature that looks in a certain way rather than communities that should be kept whole and kept together for purposes of representation. And I saw a quick question about the role of race, and the thing about, and this is why I started talking about equity. It is important to consider whether communities of color can elect candidates of choice. And that's required by the Federal Voting Rights Act, but it's also an important thing to do because the unfortunate reality is politics continues to be racialized. We are by no means a colorblind society, and the issues that are facing communities of color are in many respects similar, but in many respects different than those facing white communities. And so when we structure criteria for redistricting, again, we go equal population, contiguity, making sure that communities of color have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of choice. And then within the context of that, communities of interest come next. So in terms of transparency, and I'll be a little bit brief here to give Alex sufficient time. Transparency, like I said, should guide all phases of the redistricting process. It's hard to imagine something that has more public interest and where the stakes are higher for the public than redistricting, than a process that determines the representation that an entire state will receive for a decade. And what transparency means is that all communication, all decision-making should be publicly accessible. In practice, what if you are as the league or various other organizations in Delaware, what you should try to get from the lawmakers that are going to be drawing the maps is for them to make the timeline clear. When are they planning to draw maps? When are they planning to hold hearings? And what will the process look like? It's also important to set criteria and goals and getting lawmakers to articulate what is it that they are going to try to do in redistricting. Unfortunately, in Delaware, there aren't that many criteria that will constrict how the process plays out. And so having that articulated before they undertake the process would be best. And then it's important to try to get at least 2 rounds of public hearings, ideally once before maps are drawn, that really seeks to aim to identify communities of interest. And then second, on the back end, once draft maps are drawn, to get input on those districts and specifically on whether they preserve communities of interest or whether they're carving various communities up that in ways that don't make much sense. And then finally, it's important that people have access to the data that was used to draw the maps and to have an explanation of why certain decisions were made. Again, these are the type of kind of above board and transparent measures that help ensure that there is public confidence in the resulting maps and that people truly understand why the decisions that were made were made. And the tips for public comment, and this is really to join the community of interest discussion with the transparency discussion. The important thing, if there is an opportunity to provide public comment, there are really 4 things that you want to do in your testimony. One is you want to set the geographic boundaries of your community of interest. 2, you want to explain what is that common interest of your community, articulate it as best you can. 3, you want to relate that interest to representation and redistricting. Not all common interests are equal, and you have to relay why is it that this particular interest, that this particular method of organizing and identifying a community of interest deserves representation at the state capitol. And then finally, and this is kind of extra credit, demonstrate the inadequacy of current districts if that community of interest is not preserved under the current map. And so talking about how you know, people are split between 2 districts or 3 districts and how that hampers their ability to organize to get solutions to their issues is a really, really effective tool for public comment. And the good news is that the public is more engaged than ever, and that there are more tools than ever to help out with this. Great software and apps exist. Representable in particular is fantastic. I don't know if you are using it or planning on using it, but it really walks you through how to both draw a map and gives you the tools to be able to do that, and has prompts that cover many of these points and questions that I went over that pull your testimony together for you. There are a couple of other tools that are open source available to the public, such as Dave's Redistricting app, Districtor. These are all free, and these were all created so that the public could play a more meaningful role in setting the priorities for redistricting and could provide input that will hopefully shape the way representation plays out for the next decade. And on that note, I'll pause briefly. I think we have just 1 minute for questions on this component, but I am planning on joining the breakout groups, and we'll hopefully be able to answer more questions then.
Great, thank you, Yuri. I don't see any additional questions in the chat box right now. So unless someone's typing currently, I think, oh, there are 2. Let me see if there are.
One is mine, and that is that the league is using both Representable and Dave's Redistricting app, and I believe that Common Cause is planning to use Districtor. So those will be used here. The problem is getting people to use them and identify the districts all over the state.
Yes, that I wish I had solutions for that. I do know that folks in various states run competitions and do other things to kind of make it more fun to engage in the process. And the one thing that I would add is it would be good to, it's good to know also what submissions should look like. What would be most useful, again, assuming that the lawmakers that are going to be drawing the districts are approaching this task in good faith and will actually consider the public comments and the public submissions, figuring out what is easiest on them, what is most useful, what will allow, what will be compatible with their tools would be a really good idea.
Well, that's a big issue in Delaware because we're totally one-party state, and the other party has no voice whatsoever until it comes time to vote on the final maps. So far, as we know, there's no plan to have any public hearings, and they have no plans to identify their criteria to the public other than what the law requires. And what was another part that you mentioned that's important? They're ignoring all of those things. Plus, one of the criteria the league recommends is that it should be enforceable. The criteria should be enforceable. And one of the final criteria among the legal ones here are that it's, and I think this is in most areas, it's not supposed to be, it's not supposed to benefit one party or any individual person, but there's no way to enforce that. And just based on the nature of redistricting, which is very partisan, there's no way to enforce it other than to go to court. Do you have any comments about going to court and whether that's something that is desirable or whatever?
Well, it can be, though courts tend to be pretty hesitant to wade into various redistricting issues. Mm-hmm. They feel, generally judges feel like this is very political and it's not their role to draw political boundaries, but at the same time, there are templates for this in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania. The state courts did strike down extreme partisan gerrymanders and required those states to draw maps that were more fair to the party that was shut out of the redistricting process. So it is an option. It's usually an expensive and a long path to get relief, but it is something that can make a difference if the legislature does something egregious. The thing that I will say is there is an opportunity to still control the narrative and engage with the media and have the work that the League and Common Cause are doing in Delaware be a sort of lens through which reporters and the public understands the map that the legislature produces. And it's something that advocates in many states are doing. This is not a surprising thing to hear about the fact that it's a thoroughly political process in Delaware. But setting up a parallel public process really helps shed light on just how gross and overtly partisan redistricting often is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri. So I think at this time we're going to turn to Alex, who will be presenting to us about prison gerrymandering. Alex, the stage is yours.
Thanks. So I'm really glad y'all are here today to talk about redistricting. It's with the new maps coming up for the next decade. So Alex Keister. I'm the legal director of the Prison Policy Initiative, and we're a national organization based in Massachusetts. We're a nonpartisan and nonprofit that does work all over the country. My particular focus is on prison gerrymandering, which is how prison populations are used to skew district lines. So Yuri talked about how the most important place to start with in drawing districts is equal population. But no matter kind of what processes you have in place to ensure a fair process, you can't have fair maps and fair lines without good underlying data. And when the data itself is skewed, you end up with maps that don't represent the communities, don't represent reality. And so that's prison gerrymandering is part of that. So I'm going to set out first the problem of like what exactly is prison gerrymandering, and then we'll talk about what's been done so far to fix it and what the next steps are from here. So redistricting data that's published by the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people as if they were residents of the facility location where they were held on census day rather than at home, which is the way that most people are counted. So when you use that data for redistricting, you're moving huge swaths of people from all over the state and concentrating them in the locations that house the facilities. And when you're looking at having equal population, you're allowed a little bit of deviation here and there to account for the fact that, for example, like communities of interest aren't of equal population. So in order to be able to weigh some criteria against others, you often need to deviate a little bit from pure equal population. But you're only allowed to do that so far, because then you end up with massively unequal districts. And what prison gerrymandering has done to the data is that there are, across the country, 20 state house districts that have over 10% of their population is just people who were counted in the facilities, in the correctional facilities. So those people wouldn't be in that district, but for the fact that they were incarcerated there, and then therefore the Census Bureau counted them as if they were residents of that location. And one of those districts is actually in Delaware. So District 9 has about over 12% of the population of that district is just a single correctional facility that pads out its actual population. And this is even starker at the local level, where you can see in Wisconsin, there's Juneau County, where you look at a county commissioner district where they have 80% of the people in just one of those districts are in correctional facilities in that town. And you get into these problems where you kind of have the census data is presented as a gold standard, and some places just don't question it. So you get these huge skews in democracy where in that place I mentioned in Wisconsin, you have 20 people from the district that have the same political representation as 80 people from any of the other commissioner districts. And in Delaware, you have significant prison gerrymandering in 3 House districts, 9, 2, and 41, and they vary between about 7 to 12 to the 12% district that I mentioned. And so you can see it'd be easy to say, oh, well, you know, the people in District 9 benefit from prison gerrymandering. But if you look a bit closer, those who live in Wilmington then lose out at their local representation, because that facility that pads out your state house district then could take away your representation at the local level. You have 18% of a city council seat that's just population that's counted there from the correctional facility. So this is really a problem on all levels of government, except for congressional districts. There's just not much impact, and none in Delaware because you'll only have one. So the way we got here is that the Census Bureau started counting incarcerated people at the location of the facility right from the very first census in 1790. And back then it wasn't a problem because there just weren't that many people who were incarcerated, and those that were incarcerated relatively close to home. And of course, districting looked a lot different back then. But by 1990, you started having really precise districting with criteria, big emphasis on equality. And by then you had mass incarceration had risen to the point where you had millions of people that were counted in the wrong place. So when you started to use that data, it became a problem when it never was before. And the census defines residence as where you eat and sleep most of the time. But using that as the basis of redistricting data has two problems. One is it's incompatible with the way that states define residence for all the other purposes, including voting and representation. And for what it's worth, it's also completely incompatible with the way that the census itself takes their own definition and applies it to other living situations. So most state constitutions and statutes explicitly define residence as where you were living before your incarceration. In Delaware, the same definition applies to common law. And how this plays out is when you're incarcerated, if you're in jail on misdemeanor waiting trial, you're still allowed to vote. In Maine and Vermont, you're allowed to vote even if you're incarcerated for a felony. And you're required to vote in those situations from your home address, because that's where your representative is. That's where you have what's called like your representational nexus. That's where your community is. That's where it makes sense to vote, because that's where most of the impact will be on you. And that's where you have the right relationship as a constituent with your representative. So when you use the census data, there's a disconnect between where you're counted for representation and where you're actually constituent and which representative is responsible for you. And so, like I mentioned, for what it's worth, the Census Bureau's definition is also applied, I think, incorrectly to the incarcerated population. So the census happens every 10 years, and a lot can change between those years. And that includes where people are incarcerated. So if you look at states, like some states, like Rhode Island, your average length of incarceration is just 91 days. So it's not like people are away from home for all that long. And even those who are incarcerated for 2 years, which is kind of the national average, you're looking at folks who are there clearly less than the full 10 years. But also within those 2 years, you get moved around from facility to facility. So you're not at that same facility for all that long. And so even though you can look at a prison and see that it's a building that's full most of the time, the Census Bureau counts individual people and not buildings. So as the people move around, you can think of it as like a hotel. The hotel is full all the time in your town, but the Census Bureau won't count people there just because the building's there. They'll count everybody back at home. And this applies similarly to boarding school students who are away from home most of the time, yet are counted with their parents, because that's obviously where their constituent relationship is, with their parents' representatives. That's where the student's community is. It's not in the town where the school is. So for the 2020 census, though, the Census Bureau still counted everybody who was incarcerated at the location of the facility on Census Day, leaving it up to the states and localities to choose how to correct that data. So avoiding prison gerrymandering was first pioneered by municipalities and counties because that's where it had the biggest impact. There were places that were looking at drawing a district that would basically have no local residents in it. It would just be the prison made up the entire population of the district, so they just have an empty council seat in perpetuity. So when you're faced with drawing a map like that, the problem just becomes evident that, like, this makes no sense. These people aren't local residents. They can't have a run for office here. So those people started changing their redistricting data first. And but not everybody, but the problem doesn't always come up with the way that redistricting is done. Sometimes you just kind of like rubber stamp the maps from year to year. And one example of that was in Anamosa, Iowa, where you had a city that was divided into 4 wards. It's what they called their city council districts. And each ward had about 1,400 people in it, except for one that had the state penitentiary in it that was over 1,300 people. So they only had, I think, 58 actual residents in one of the wards. And they just never noticed because the council kind of elected the same people. The wards just kind of stayed the same from year to year. And until finally one of the city councilors retired and nobody stepped up to run from that ward. And with 58 people, like obviously chances are low that any one of those folks are going to step up. And what happened is they voted in this guy, Danny Young, who's a backhoe operator. He got voted in with 2 votes. There were 2 write-in votes. Neither one of them was his, so it came as a big shock to him that he was all of a sudden the city councilor. And then he led the effort to change the way that the data that they use for redistricting, because obviously he only had to take care of represent 58 constituents, whereas everybody else had 1,400 people that they were responsible for. And of course, the more cities and localities started doing this, and the more that we made the work, we made the problem of prison gerrymandering more transparent, more folks were aware of it, states started fixing the problem. And Delaware is one of them. So congrats, guys. We have, right around the last census, right around 2010, there were 4 states that passed laws to end prison gerrymandering. California just punted their effective date to 2020 right off the bat. Delaware attempted to do it in 2010, but the state couldn't quite get it together to get the data into the redistricting software. So then the effective date was changed to this redistricting cycle. But Maryland and New York already redistricted based on a reallocation of incarcerated people back to their home address last cycle. So now for this cycle, we're up to 9 states that are going to be doing the redistricting with counting everybody who's incarcerated back at home, and that includes Delaware. And so what the census is doing, even though they still counted everybody at the facility location, but they're helping out states who are doing this adjustment. And what they're doing is when they publish the data, they're actually publishing the locations of the facilities in the data, which they hadn't done before. So this lets a state basically take home address data from the Department of Corrections and then to see where in the census data those facilities are represented, to be able to do their own adjustment person by person, just take out all the facility populations and then count everybody back at home. And the way that that works, and this is what the state's doing right now, is a process called geocoding. So you take an address from the Department of Corrections, like 123 Main Street, some town, Delaware. Maybe it's got a zip code on it. Sometimes it doesn't. And you try to get that pinned to a point on a map. And this is part of the process that takes the longest time because the Census Bureau doesn't publish its data with addresses. It's all published in blocks. So if you're in a city, you can think of a city block. Out in the country, they're just kind of larger tracts of land. So you just get this lump of land with a population number on it. And that's what the data looks like. So when you take people's home addresses and you try to map them out, you need to basically make it compatible with the census data. You need to know which block number, essentially, they need to be assigned to. And this process should be done, rightly so, before the data ever comes out, because you can have all the home addresses mapped out with the block numbers, because that's something you already have from the Census Bureau. So that when the Census Bureau data comes out, which is very late this year, all you have to do is drop the people into the right blocks, and take out the prison population that they've already flagged for you in that special table that's coming with the redistricting data. So you don't even need to look elsewhere for it. And so the biggest question then is how much cleanup you do of the data. Like, for example, if the zip code's missing, that's something that's easy to figure out. But if half the data is missing zip codes, it's just going to take time. Another thing that comes up often is, somebody says, oh, I live on 123 Main Road. Well, there's no main road. Is it street or is it avenue? Those kind of things need a little bit of cleanup. So you're never going to get it quite perfectly. So when it's up to the states to end prison gerrymandering, you're always going to have, well, just a product that's less than perfect, rather than having the Census Bureau count everybody in the right spot, to begin with. So in this kind of allocation, I'd expect something in the 80% range. Like if you get 80% of the people counted back at home, that's a good success. So that's when you're looking at the data, just to know, like, don't be disappointed with something that's 80%. And depending on who's doing the actual data reallocation, what the culture is like within that office, that might be different to how, that might impact how they talk about the process themselves. In Maryland, it was the planning department that did it last time, and I think they were kind of a little bit perfectionist, and they were really hard on themselves about the data when they put out their final report of their reallocation attempts. In the failure column, they listed everybody who lived out of state, that, they were so bummed they couldn't count them in the state, but like, they don't have jurisdiction there. So, definitely take the reports with a grain of salt, but so know that you should have the majority of the people reallocated for sure. But just because it's not 100% doesn't mean it wasn't a failure. And, putting it in context, you have data that was a lot better than whatever you started with. Right. Counting most people in the right place is better than counting everybody in the wrong place.
Yeah. So Alex, then if they just eliminate counting the people from out of state, that would be a good way to get started. So that would increase the percentage of correct answers they get, and then they could feel better about it, right? In other words, just not count the people that are from out of state.
Yeah, and I think the Delaware statute says, yeah, they should not be counted. So that definitely should be reflected in the reports of the population of the reallocation data. But basically, I think I don't know how detailed the reports are going to end up being, if there is a report at all.
Yeah,
but
we probably won't see a report, but there will be one.
So there'll be some disconnect between the total population as reported in the census and as reported in the actual redistricting data. And this is actually something where it's, it would be better for the Census Bureau to do this than to have the states do it ad hoc, because as Yuri mentioned, there are these redistricting tools that are available now. But something like Districtor and DRA won't have the reallocated data in it. So those tools all use the Census Bureau's data. I know a couple of states like Legal Women Voters in with Common Cause in Ohio and Maine are putting together their own wrapper, trying to get that data in there as much as possible, or at least flag the prison populations.
Oh, wow.
But
and how are they getting the data from the prison? Ours is coming from the Department of Correction. They apparently have already determined the last home address as of April 1st of last year for all the prisoners that were there then, which is appropriate. But they're in the process of geocoding, I understand. But how could those leagues get that data? Would they have to, in our case, would we have to get it from the Department of Correction? Because I don't think we'll be successful if we have to do that.
No, there would be certainly privacy concerns as well with that. in order to get the data that the state is using, you'd have to go to the state. I know California makes their data publicly accessible.
Gotcha.
Some states more so
Okay.
than others. But
Right.
what you can do is, I think, kind of at the very least, some of the states are trying to get the redistricting software to flag correctional populations so that you don't, like, as the public is trying to draw their own district superpose,
Mhm.
that they don't accidentally prison gerrymander or something,
Gotcha.
you know.
Okay.
So the flag would come up like, oh, you know, this district contains 5% correctional facility. You still want to proceed?
Right. We have a question about what about prisoners from Delaware that are housed in another state? Is there any way to, I mean, or is there a way to count them, or is that not appropriate or necessary or possible? Or
I mean, it's theoretically possible with, you know, if you throw enough money and political will at it, but in practical terms, it wouldn't make much of a difference.
Mhm. Yeah.
There tends to be very little interstate transfer of folks. The biggest chunk of that would be people held by the Federal Bureau of Prisons,
Mhm.
who move people across the country just willy-nilly for administrative ease. But the Federal Bureau of Prisons is not cooperating with any of the states for data sharing.
Okay. We had a question that said that wonders why it's important to do this, because wouldn't it be the case that prisoners have a lot in common, and so they would be the prison itself would be a community of interest? And I'll try to answer that one myself if you don't mind, and then you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But the fact is that in Delaware, it's so far we've had a lot of trouble enabling prisoners to vote, period. So they're not voters. They can't vote for the representative in whose district they're imprisoned. So they're not really a community of interest that counts, because the representative, and I can tell you who the representatives are from those three districts. District 2 is Representative Bolden from Wilmington. 9 is Representative Hensley, who has the biggest one. And then Representative Collins apparently has Sussex Correctional Institution. So they can't vote, and they're not voting for those people, not likely anyway. And so that's not a community of interest, because they're not voters. At least right now they're not, because we haven't been able to work with the Department of Corrections in a manner that allows them to vote.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind too is that even if they were allowed to vote, the incarcerated population is not like a monolithic block. All they have in common is that they're housed together at this moment. They have much more in common.
Yeah. In fact, some of them are I mean, some of them are just people that are waiting trial. As of the last data that I got, which was a couple of years ago, something like 30% of our prisoners were waiting trial. They weren't even found guilty yet, but they were in prison. So anyway, that shows those people were probably back by now in their original district. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? Because we need to go into the breakouts. Okay, I guess we're ready for the breakouts, Kira.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You get to choose which room you get to go into. If you have any issues at all, please send me a direct message in the chat room. Thank you. Everybody should be able to pick.
So far, all we see is the thing that says join a break room. Are we supposed to click on that box?
And there's no rooms?
Oh, there's a box with 4 boxes in it. And we're supposed to click on that, and then we go to where we want to go.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.
No.
They're moving slow. They're going though.
Well, how do we choose? How do we know which one to choose?
Whichever one you
are
want.
you interested in?
Well, what are the choices? 1, 2, 3, or 4? That doesn't help much.
No,
You don't have names?
Joanne, there's a box on the bottom of your screen that has 4 boxes in it. And
Yeah,
if you click on that, it'll list the breakout rooms.
okay.
You can, and then you
Oh,
can click on
okay,
join,
okay.
whichever one you want to join.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay. It's going slow.
I'm still not sure what I hit to join the group.
Okay, Coralie,
Mhm.
which group would you like to go into?
Well, I think I'm most interested in communities of interest, although that's already a big group.
That's okay, you can go in that one.
Okay,
I'm gonna push you in there.
great, thank you. What do you room?
This is Gina Green, and I don't have that option on the bottom of my screen of rooms at all. I have
That's okay, you tell me which one would you like, communities of interest, transparency, or prison-based gerrymandering?
transparency, please.
All right.
Thank you.
And then make sure some people went in there.
Hello?
Hello. Penny, are you did you want to get into a room?
Actually, I think I'm fine. I might go. I'm fine without it.
Okay. Yeah, I only had 3 people who haven't jumped in a room. You know? It is kind of funny just sitting here though, and I'm watching everyone talk. You know. Hmm. Just takes a minute to get everyone back.
This was very well done, Kira.
Nancy. I think actually, do our reporters have anything to report back? I was a little sad I didn't get to go into prison gerrymandering, but I was controlling everything. Dwayne, do you have anything from your room?
Sure, we had a great conversation. We talked about redistricting and that you can draw components of an entire district, because it can be overwhelming in some of these larger districts to kind of figure out communities outside of your very own neighborhood. So we talked about how you can draw these component pieces, and when you add those together and keep them together in the larger district, that serves an important input mechanism as well. We also talked about diversity in incomes within a district and how that can result in different kinds of candidacies in each of those districts. And so it's really important to think about how you're grouping people together based on income level as well. And then we also talked about that redistricting is happening at all these different levels, right? That we have other states are lucky enough to have federal redistricting, but we have our state redistricting, but also think about county commissions, city councils, things like that, school boards even, and how they're going through redistricting and how that can really be important to some of your communities of interest as well. Let me know if I missed anything, group. We had a great combo.
That was really interesting. And that was a lot of information. Denise, do you have anything to report back?
Well, I was answering some questions around transparency. And in general, I think the overarching question was around the drawing of maps, how transparent our process has not been in Delaware, and whether or not going forward, we anticipate things will change with respect to having the legislature be more transparent about what they are doing, the timing of that, and providing the public with some information about the hearings, as well as, in enough time for people to actually have an opportunity to participate broadly, as well as have access to the data and the explanations as to how lines are drawn. So there was a lot of discussion around those things.
Oh, well, wonderful. Well, definitely, we all need to fight for transparency. Very big case. And Maureen, do you have anything?
Yes. Sandy can correct me if I hit anything that is a little off. I had the question. I was curious about what agency or group handles the allocation for like the prison gerrymandering, and while the Department of Corrections gets the addresses and stuff, it's the House and Senate reallocation staff that is going to be responsible for it. And then the big thing that I didn't know anything about before, and that we'll have to keep an eye on, is that the Delaware statute only applies to the state districts. And so there will be an effect on this for Wilmington and how they allocate for themselves. And so I need to learn more about that now.
Yeah, I definitely want to learn more about that too. So Joanne has a question, and I might have the answer, but I want to check with Sandy. Do we have access to any information about population of each district in its current legislative form?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, we have the latest census data. We have the ACS, American Community Survey, and I think the latest data in there is 2019 and maybe even
It's
up to
2018, Sandy, and it's an estimate, but we do have that, yeah.
uh-huh.
So
And
that
I
would,
think
that
there's
would give the
also estimates of 2020, but those estimates have been shown to be wrong. And in fact, in Delaware, they underestimated in Delaware, and the latest data on Delaware that is accurate, that was issued when for the apportionment of congressional seats, that number was among the higher ones in terms of how much higher it was than the estimate. But anyway, we do have some data that we can use to start the process before that we get the real data.
Right. And then the last question is, what commission or committee in our legislature does the redistricting, and who should we badger?
Well, I can tell you that the Speaker of the House is going to be the key in the House. And the majority leader, he was majority leader last time when Senator Gilligan, or no, Representative Gilligan, who was the Speaker then, appointed Pete to do it for 2011. And he really enjoyed that process. And so he wants to do it again, and he'll be the key person. And Valerie, I'm sure will be able to, Valerie Longhurst, I'm sure will be able to influence it as well. But I think anybody in the caucus, in the Democratic caucus, will be able to influence what he does about their own districts. And then the Republicans just, don't have a voice, period. And the Senate, I'm not sure how exactly that's going to go. There's a committee of staff people from the House and the Senate that are working on making sure that it happens this year. And that committee, I'm not sure who's on it. I would imagine that Dick Carter is a key person because he's a staff person in the Senate who has been involved for at least 3 decades. But I'm not sure who else would be on that. And but I think that issue about the fact that our law only applies to the state is really significant for Wilmington. So we may be able to get some Wilmington people to, work on that and make sure that that they get that straightened out for the city council. That could be a huge issue for the city council.
Okay, well, we are at our 12:30 mark, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I will be sending out a link to the video, also links to some important things that you might find useful, like Dave's redistricting app, representative. I actually had one more thing to share with you guys in the chat before I can keep talking. I'd like to get it in there. One of the things that's going to help us a lot is if you tell us your story. Tell us your story about your area. We want to find these communities of interest. So we created a form. It's a little bit different than everything else that you've been doing. And I want to just thank Marge Johnson for doing everything I send out. But if you could answer these 5 questions, it would help us get an idea. And I put the link in the chat, an idea of what your area is like and what you would like to keep together. So all these little things asking you to answer these questions, representable, outreach circle, is helping us put together where communities of interest are. So I'm not just randomly sending you out links. I need this information. So whichever form you're comfortable in, whatever program I send out, you're comfortable with, if that's the only one you want to answer, that's fine. I'm getting your information on in the area you live in, and that will help us all create fair maps for everyone.
If I'm on the Second District Neighborhood Planning Council.
Okay.
Oh,
Is it appropriate to have the Second District Neighborhood Planning Council weigh in on this?
sure, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be definitely, even if you guys wanted, like, at one of your meetings, sit together and draw these, draw little maps for us or answer questions together. That would really help, because now you're doing it as a group.
Yeah,
Also,
we can
Dwayne
do that.
just put a link in the chat of where the redistricting procedures are for Wilmington.
Can we get, I mean, I don't have a way to write this down right now. Can we get copies of the things from the chat when we get the information from?
Yes,
you?
I could send the links that he added to the chat links.
There's a
to the
couple links
email.
in the chat that are important, I think.
Right, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's hard to talk and copy the chat, so I like to send out that follow-up email so you have everything, and then you can refer back to it. But also getting involved will help us. You don't have to do 40 hours a week, but talk to your friends and neighbors about it. You never know who's interested in redistricting until you mention it to them. And the more public people we have helping us, not just organizations, we're really going to understand our communities in Delaware to help us draw back good maps.
The other thing, Catherine, is that we do have a PowerPoint presentation that you could use to inform your council members about redistricting in general. And
that would be wonderful, because many of the members of the Second District Neighborhood Planning Council are also members of the community associations.
right. And we have been working with the Newcastle County Civic League, and they've been very helpful. In fact, we drew a map of District 16 last week at their meeting, right online. And so we could even come in and help you work on that kind of thing if you wanted us to.
Well, and one of our members is also on the Third District Neighborhood Planning Council. So
okay, great.
There's possibility to, I mean, all of us are so close together. Our interests are similar, but the districts really are pretty different.
Yeah.
So
right.
Right.
Okay. One thing I want to, Kara, I want to add one thing about transparency.
Okay.
It struck me during this presentation that maybe, since it's unlikely that our legislature is going to have hearings, that maybe what our coalition, the League, ACLU, Common Cause, the Civic League of Newcastle County, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, the Network Delaware, and other groups could sponsor our own hearings and make them very public, and make sure that we get to all the media to cover these events. And then we could have more influence, as Yuri recommended. So I'd like to, we'll talk about that at our next meeting.
I think that's
I love that idea, Sandy. Go ahead, Catherine.
I just was going to say that I think it's a wonderful idea.
And I think that fits also, I think our strongest persuasion as a group is going to be if we show the Delaware legislature the best practices of how to do this, right? And so that involves community input and then drawing a map that is based on communities of interest. And so I think as long as we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's, we can say, listen, we showed you exactly how to do it. And then they got to adopt our map, right?
Right.
I do love your
I love it.
Okay, anyway, thank you for coming. And don't forget, May 11th is school board elections. You can go to vote411.org to learn about the 30 candidates that are going for 13 seats. So you really want to know who your candidates are. Thank you for, again, please feel free to get involved. We're always looking for people to get involved. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you all.